It was a sweltering summer afternoon in the heart of Texas when Tom Gallagher first realized something was terribly wrong. Life on his ranch usually moved with a slow, familiar rhythm: quiet mornings, the rustling of trees, the steady beat of hooves. But that day, the silence felt heavier. His horse Charlie wasn't waiting by the fence like he usually did. Tom found him lying down in the pasture, his coat dull, his breathing labored. There was a stillness in Charlie's eyes that chilled Tom to the bone. He rushed to his side, calling out to him, hoping it was just heat exhaustion or a minor illness, but deep down he knew it was something worse. Charlie wasn't just a horse, he was family. They had spent years together working the land, riding through the hills, competing in rodeos. The thought of losing him so suddenly didn't feel real. Without wasting a moment, Tom called the local vet. Hours passed in slow agony as tests were run, fluids administered and possible treatments attempted. But nothing worked. With every minute, Charlie's condition deteriorated. His breathing became shallow, his body weaker, and the light in his eyes faded more. The vet couldn't explain the cause at first, but the word poison began to surface in whispers, first in suggestion, then as a probable cause. The idea hit Tom like a punch to the gut. Who would want to harm Charlie? The horse was beloved by the community, a rodeo star admired for his strength and spirit. Tom racked his brain, thinking of every interaction, every person who had visited the ranch recently. Was this a targeted attack, a jealous competitor, or just a cruel twist of fate? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the field, Tom sat beside Charlie, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck. He could feel the shallow breaths beneath his fingers. Tears welled in his eyes, not just from fear but from helplessness. This horse had carried him through more than just trails, through life's storms, heartaches, and triumphs. And now, Charlie was slipping away, and Tom didn't know how to stop it. But even in the thick of sorrow, something stirred inside him. A quiet voice, steady and clear, told him he couldn't give up. Not now, not like this. If medicine couldn't save Charlie, then he'd find another way, even if it meant risking everything. As night fell and the stars blinked awake, Tom made a promise. He would do whatever it took to save his friend. No matter how far he had to go or what he had to face, he wasn't going to let Charlie die without a fight. The morning after Charlie's condition took a turn for the worse, Tom Gallagher stood at the edge of the stable, watching his horse struggle to breathe. The vet had returned early, his face grave, confirming what Tom already feared: Charlie had been poisoned. But worse, the vet couldn't identify the exact type of toxin. It was rare, dangerous, and possibly fatal if left untreated. Time was running out. The uncertainty was maddening, and Tom knew he couldn't just sit and wait for answers that might come too late. He started replaying the last few days in his mind, every visitor, every conversation, every small detail. That's when a name surfaced: Rick Jensen. An old acquaintance, a fellow horseman, and someone Tom knew had always been a little too interested in Charlie's success. They had crossed paths at rodeos, and Tom recalled a certain envy in Rick's eyes. It was a stretch, but when you're desperate, even a shadow of suspicion is enough to push you forward. Still, Tom wasn't ready to accuse anyone just yet. Instead, he shifted his focus to the ranch itself, walking every inch of the pasture, checking the stables, looking for anything that seemed out of place. That's when he noticed a dark, dried stain near Charlie's water trough. It wasn't something he remembered seeing before. Kneeling down, Tom took a sample, wrapping it carefully. He wasn't a scientist, but he knew someone who might be able to help. An old friend of his late father, a chemistry professor at a nearby university, had always taken an interest in rural animal care. With the sample in hand, Tom jumped into his truck, driving with a mix of panic and purpose. He felt a deep sense of guilt weighing on him, like he'd failed Charlie by not noticing sooner. But there was still a sliver of hope, and Tom wasn't about to waste it. At the university lab, the professor got to work immediately. Tom watched nervously as the tests were run, his heart pounding in his chest. Minutes felt like hours until the professor finally turned to him with a heavy expression. The poison was rare, potent, and nearly impossible to treat with standard methods. It wasn't the kind of substance someone stumbled upon by accident. It was deliberate. That realization hit Tom like a wave. This wasn't just bad luck. Someone had meant to hurt Charlie, and if modern medicine wasn't going to save him, Tom would have to turn elsewhere. He remembered stories from his father and grandfather, Tales of cowboys using natural remedies and wild herbs to treat their animals when nothing else worked. Desperate but determined, he thought of a reclusive old healer in a nearby town, Hank, a man known for strange cures and knowledge passed down through generations. Tom knew it sounded crazy, but at that moment, it didn't matter. He had nothing left to lose. Charlie was still fighting, and Tom would fight too with everything he had. Tom didn't sleep that night. After leaving the university with confirmation of the poison's toxicity, he drove straight to the outskirts of a small rural town where Hank the local herbalist still lived and worked. The man was older than Tom remembered, with eyes that seemed to see right through him. Tom explained Charlie's condition and the poison. Hank listened without saying a word, then nodded slowly and pulled out a worn leather notebook. He pointed to a rare herb, a wild plant that only grew high in the distant mountains. It was the only known antidote, he said, but it wouldn't be easy to find. The journey would be long and dangerous, and time wasn't on Tom's side. Even so, there wasn't a trace of hesitation in his voice when he said he'd go. He left at dawn the next day, a small pack on his back, a photo of Charlie in his shirt pocket, and a map drawn by Hank showing the path through the mountain trails. The hike was more brutal than Tom expected. The Texas heat pressed down like a weight, and the humidity soaked through his clothes within an hour. The terrain was rugged, unforgiving thick woods, steep hills, and sharp rocks that cut through his boots. He pushed on, every muscle aching, fueled only by the thought of Charlie lying helpless back at the ranch. Whenever his body begged him to stop, he pictured those dark, tired eyes, the shallow breathing, the years of trust they had built. That image was enough to keep his legs moving. At one point, he had to lower himself down a cliffside with a rope, slipping once and nearly falling before catching himself on a ledge. Scraped, bruised, and covered in sweat, he kept moving forward. As he climbed, the skies above him began to shift. Clouds rolled in fast, and the first drops of rain tapped against the dry ground. Within minutes, it became a storm. By the time Tom found the herb, the sky had gone nearly black. The hidden field Hank described was real, a quiet, strange little meadow surrounded by jagged rocks and thick fog. It felt otherworldly, as if the place itself was guarding the plants. He moved quickly, picking only what he needed, wrapping the herbs in cloth to keep them dry. But just as he turned to leave, the storm struck in full. Sheets of rain pounded the mountainside. The wind howled, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Every step on the way down was a risk. The mud pulled at his feet, and the soaked herbs felt twice as heavy now. Then, the worst happened. He slipped on a loose rock, tumbling several feet down a slope. Pain exploded through his side as he hit the ground hard. For a moment, he couldn't move. But then, through the ringing in his ears, he thought of Charlie. That quiet strength, that loyalty. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself up. Bloodied, soaked, and in pain, Tom began the final push back home, driven by one truth. If he didn't make it, Charlie wouldn't either. By the time Tom stumbled back onto the ranch, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pasture. Every inch of his body ached. His ribs throbbed from the fall, his legs trembled from exhaustion, and his hands, still clutching the soaked bundle of herbs, were raw and shaking. But there was no time to rest. He pushed open the stable doors and dropped to his knees beside Charlie, who was still lying weakly on the straw-covered floor. His eyes were barely open, but there was a faint flicker of life left in them. Tom didn't speak, he just got to work. With trembling hands, he crushed and prepared the herbs exactly as Hank had instructed, adding a bit of warm water and mixing it into a thick, bitter-smelling paste. He gently lifted Charlie's head and helped him swallow it, praying silently, over and over, that he hadn't come too late. The night that followed was the longest of Tom's life. He didn't leave Charlie's side, not for food, not for sleep. The storm outside had passed, but the one inside him still raged on. He watched every rise and fall of Charlie's chest, listened to every strained breath, waiting for the slightest sign the remedy was working. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of rain dripping from the barn roof. Tom talked to Charlie in whispers, reminding him of all their rides together, all the places they'd been, the rodeos, the quiet trails through the hills. He reminded Charlie of who they were more than man and horse. They were partners. Sometime deep into the night, just as Tom was starting to drift into a half-sleep, he felt a movement. Charlie's head shifted slightly. Then, slowly, shakily, the horse began to lift it higher. Tom shot up, heart pounding. He watched in disbelief as Charlie moved his legs, trying to rise. It was clumsy and weak, but it was real. By dawn, Charlie was standing. Not fully steady and clearly still recovering, but upright on his own 4 feet. Tom couldn't hold back the tears of relief, gratitude, and something like awe, all flooding him at once. Against the odds, against time, against everything that should have beaten them, Charlie was alive. That day, Tom stayed by him, watching him closely, offering small amounts of food and water, careful not to push too much too fast. There was a quiet strength in Charlie's eyes now, as if he too understood what they had just come through. The recovery ahead would be long, and Tom knew it, but that no longer mattered. What once seemed impossible had taken its first step into reality. Tom realized that this wasn't just about saving a horse, it was about holding onto something pure in a world that sometimes tried to break you. In that moment, he understood the full weight of what they'd fought for, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope again. As Charlie slowly regained strength over the following days, Tom remained cautious. Though the horse was no longer on the brink of death, something still didn't sit right with him. The relief of saving Charlie couldn't erase the lingering question that haunted his thoughts: who would do something so cruel? Why poison a horse, especially one like Charlie who had brought nothing but admiration and pride to the community? The more Tom thought about it, the more determined he became to find answers. He began observing his surroundings more carefully, neighbors' behavior, odd glances, anything that might hint at someone hiding something. Then one morning, an unexpected visitor arrived. Earl, an old friend of Tom's late father. A hardened war veteran, Earl had a sharp instinct for trouble, and he didn't waste time. With a serious look, he told Tom that the authorities were quietly investigating the possibility that Charlie's poisoning was intentional and that someone in the local community might be involved. The news hit Tom like a gut punch. Someone from his own backyard? Someone he probably shook hands with, shared conversations with. The thought was sickening. With tension rising in his chest, Tom decided not to wait for the authorities to piece it together. He'd find the truth himself. He started visiting nearby properties under the pretense of casual conversation, but in truth he was watching, listening for anything that felt off. That's when he noticed something strange while walking near the property of Mark, a neighbor he had known for years. A sharp chemical odor lingered in the air, one that didn't belong on a ranch. Mark's reaction when Tom showed up unannounced was also different: nervous, twitchy, like he had something to hide. Tom played it cool, asked a few questions, but deep inside, suspicion grew like wildfire. Days passed, and pieces started falling into place. It was Mark who had always harbored some quiet resentment after losing a land deal to Tom years ago. But even if bitterness lingered, Tom never imagined it could turn into something this dark. The truth came out sooner than expected. Cornered by Tom's pointed questions and thinly veiled frustration, Mark finally cracked. With shaky hands and a voice full of guilt, he confessed, but not everything was his doing. Someone had paid him, a man with power, with influence, someone who wanted Tom broken. "I didn't want to do it," Mark admitted, "but they offered more than I could say no to. They knew you'd fight for that horse. They wanted to watch you fall apart trying." Tom stood there frozen, every muscle tight, his mind racing. It wasn't just about Charlie anymore, it was about betrayal, manipulation, and the lengths people would go to for power. The man behind it all was Preston Harper, a wealthy developer who saw Tom's ranch as an obstacle in his expansion plans. He hadn't just tried to take Tom's land, he'd tried to break his spirit, but he'd underestimated the bond between a man and his horse. And now, with the truth in hand, Tom knew exactly what had to come next. He wasn't just going to protect what was his, he was going to finish what this man started, on his own terms. Tom didn't sleep the night he learned the truth. The name Preston Harper echoed in his mind like a warning bell: wealthy, ruthless, and used to getting what he wanted. Now Tom knew that Charlie's suffering hadn't just been an act of malice, but part of a calculated plan to push him off his land. That knowledge lit something inside him, not just anger, but resolve. The next morning, before the sun rose, Tom saddled his truck and drove straight to Preston's mansion. The house loomed at the end of a long drive, all glass and stone and money. Preston greeted him with a smug expression, clearly expecting him. But Tom wasn't the same man he'd been weeks ago. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With calm, unshakable certainty, he told Preston he knew everything, and that the authorities would soon know too. Preston tried to maintain control, hiding behind threats and power, but Tom wasn't afraid anymore. Justice didn't come with a badge that day, but with truth, and Preston saw it in Tom's eyes. For the first time, the man backed down. Back at the ranch, Tom stood beside Charlie in the golden light of evening. The horse, still a little slower than before, had returned to the routines they both loved: walking the pastures, breathing in the familiar air, resting in the barn where so much had changed. Tom watched him with a new kind of appreciation, every movement a small miracle. The pain, the uncertainty, the fear, they had all left scars, but also something else: clarity. Life had tested them both in ways neither could have predicted, and somehow they had come through it together. People from town started to stop by, offering support, checking in on Charlie, even apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner. The land felt different now, like it had been defended, not just owned. And in that quiet space, with the storm behind them, Tom found himself thinking less about revenge and more about renewal. He didn't want to be defined by the damage, but by how he rebuilt from it. There's something deeply human in the way we cling to what matters when the world tries to take it away. Tom's journey isn't just about a man saving his horse. It's about loyalty, courage, and standing firm when everything feels like it's falling apart. It's about knowing that sometimes doing the right thing won't be easy, and that the people who seem the strongest can still be targets. But above all, it's about the bond we build when we truly care for animals, for land, for something bigger than ourselves. As Tom and Charlie walked the fields that summer evening side by side, their pace slow but steady, it was clear they had been changed, not broken. They were living proof that love backed by action can survive the worst of storms. And maybe that's the lesson. When life knocks you down, don't just get back up with purpose. Because in the end, the fight you didn't choose might become the story that defines your strength. Charlie's recovery was slow but steady. Every morning, Tom would find him standing a little taller, eating a little more, walking a few steps farther than the day before. It wasn't just physical strength returning, it was spirit. But even as Charlie's body healed, something in him had changed. The once restless horse who used to bolt through fields with wild energy now moved more cautiously, more aware. His eyes, though still deep and kind, carried a quiet intensity, like he had looked into something dark and returned wiser. Tom noticed it too. The bond between them, already strong, had deepened in silence. There were moments when Charlie would simply look at him, not as an animal looks at its owner, but as an equal who had survived something together. Tom couldn't explain it, but he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just recovery, it was transformation. Tom, too, felt a shift within himself. Life had always been about routines: the ranch, the work, the next rodeo. But now, there was a pause in his rhythm, a new kind of stillness in his heart. In the long nights watching over Charlie, he had learned patience in a way no rodeo or drought could ever teach. He began to notice things he had once overlooked. The way the wind moved the grass in the evening, the slow blink of Charlie's eyes, the sound of breath returning to steady rhythm. What had once been taken for granted now felt sacred. The brush with loss had made every ordinary moment feel like a small gift. More than anything, Tom realized how much of his life had been built on the presence of his horse. It wasn't just companionship, it was identity. Without Charlie, he might have lost more than just a friend. He might have lost himself. One quiet afternoon, Tom and Charlie stood side by side in the pasture, the golden light stretching long across the field. Tom reached out, resting a hand on Charlie's shoulder, and for a long time, neither of them moved. There was no need for noise. Everything they had survived was etched in the silence between them. In that moment, Tom thought back to his father's words. You don't know what you're made of until you've had to fight for something that can't speak for itself. Now, those words lived inside him. He wasn't just a man with a horse. He was a man changed by one. And Charlie wasn't just the horse that came back from the edge. He was the mirror that showed Tom who he really was. This healing wasn't just about the body. It was about becoming whole again, together. As the days turned into weeks, life on the ranch slowly returned to a sense of rhythm. But underneath the calm, Tom remained vigilant. He knew the danger that once threatened Charlie could come back in another form. Though Preston Harper had been exposed and forced to retreat, Tom didn't trust that people like him ever truly disappeared. There was always another scheme, another way to come after what they couldn't control. But Tom was no longer the man who simply reacted to threats. He had grown into someone who anticipated them. He took steps to better protect the ranch, not just with fences or cameras, but by building stronger ties with his neighbors, the community, the people who had once stood at a distance. He shared his story not to gain sympathy, but to make sure others knew what could happen when you value something deeply. If Charlie's suffering had taught him anything, it was that silence breeds shadows. Truth had to be spoken, even when it hurt. Yet, even in his guardedness, Tom found himself living more openly. He and Charlie began riding again, not with the urgency of training or competition, but with a sense of appreciation. Each trail they followed was a reminder of the road they had already walked together. Charlie, though still bearing the physical remnants of his ordeal, moved with a sense of peace Tom hadn't seen before. It wasn't the wild gallop of the past, but a purposeful, steady stride. And Tom matched it. They no longer needed speed, they needed presence. With each passing day, Tom began to let go of the bitterness he had held toward Preston and Mark. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to the anger was like dragging a chain behind him. It slowed him down. He wasn't erasing the past. He was choosing not to be anchored by it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky burned orange, Tom stood at the fence and looked over the land. Charlie grazed quietly a few feet away, his silhouette calm against the fading light. In that stillness, Tom finally felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time: peace. Not the absence of hardship, but the acceptance of everything that had come before and everything that was still unknown. Life would always carry risk. There would always be people who tried to take what you loved. But now, Tom understood that the strength to endure came from what you build in the quiet moments: trust, loyalty, and the courage to fight without losing your heart. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the start of a new kind of life. One built not on fear, but on the kind of love that survives even the darkest storms. And as he watched Charlie raise his head toward the wind, Tom knew, whatever came next, they would face it together.